over 90 young activists gathered at the estate of conservative luminary William F. Buckley in Sharon, Connecticut. They wrote and adopted the Sharon Statement. Don't try to read this. But which asserted the principles of free market capitalism, limited government, and hawkish international anti-communism. The meeting at Sharon laid the groundwork for the new right, and the movement found its young torchbearers to carry it towards political ascendancy. Buckley later wrote that what is so striking about the students who met at Sharon is their, quote, appetite for power. And so the Young Americans for Freedom were born as the leading conservative student organization of the decade. So my research examines and explains how the YAF, a conservative youth organization, became the premier political organization in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I will argue that the YAF employed law and order politics in order to successfully increase their popularity on college campuses. And overall, charting the origins and evolutions of the YAF during the turbulent years of the 1960s allows us to gain deeper insight into the rise of conservatism in the latter half of the 20th century. So my research consists of three main points. First is that a great portion of the population was troubled and disturbed by the student New Left, or the New Left in general, not only their radical ideology, but their methods of direct action. Second, that the YAF increased in membership and popularity when they shifted focus to combating the New Left or student radicals through anti-radical coalitions with more moderate students. This increased visibility exposed students to conservatism and to the YAF, which was an organization that would ultimately mold students into career conservatives. And then furthermore, the YAF introduced students to discourse which would ultimately fracture the Democratic Party. They were effectively able to conflate the New Left and liberal Democrats. This message undermined the Great Society Project and the prospect of a welfare state, and toughened the discourse on crime, which would ultimately end up shifting the Democratic Party even to the right. So brief background on the rise of the right. 4 years after Sharon, Barry Goldwater, the RNC nominated Barry Goldwater in 1964 as the first presidential candidate of the new right. His platform pretty much mirrored the Sharon Statement and represented a marked shift to the right versus the platform of Eisenhower. And then eventually, skip through Nixon, all that, and you get Reagan, you get the Reagan presidency, which catalyzed a profound bipartisan shift to the right in American politics, as is evidenced by the emergence of Reagan Democrats and future Democratic President Bill Clinton's announcement that he is a new kind of Democrat. This new Democrat continued in the footsteps of his Republican predecessors in many ways. He exploited fears of crime, escalated the war on drugs and police militarization, embraced neoliberal trade deals, and restricted access to welfare programs. So it is then clear that the new right, which rose out of the post-World War II conservative movement, overwhelmingly shaped the political climate of the 20th century, and that the Young Americans for Freedom were also integral throughout this rise. So in the wake of Clinton's presidency and his pronounced shift to the right, historians started questioning how did this happen in a post-New Deal United States. One of these answers is law and order politics. So law and order politics undergirded the rise of the right because they created a crisis for liberalism while hardening the national discourse on crime and civic unrest. Nixon's campaign was most notable for capitalizing on generational cultural anxieties and people's fear that the United States was falling apart due to crimes, riots, and civil unrest. Ultimately, Republicans were effectively able to contend that the welfare state had failed Americans. It took hard-earned middle-class taxpayer money and then squandered it on undeserved handouts while failing to ensure a sense of security. Not only did law and order politics temporarily destroy the domestic credibility of the Democrats, it also laid the groundwork for a bipartisan consensus on a racist mass incarceration state that persists to this day, which has been elaborated on by scholars such as Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow. So this brings me back to, well, this is a picture of the YF in the early 1960s. But this brings me back to law and order politics on campus in the 60s. So the New Left was probably was one defining political movement of the 1960s. It understood Western society and capitalism as a system that relied on racism, colonialism, and imperialism. It also distanced itself from the labor movements of the First World, viewing even the opulence of the middle class as inherently exploitative. In short, it was a movement demanding radical change, and as a corollary, regarded both conservatives in the Republican Party and liberals in the Democratic Party as enemies of liberation. The New Left is often viewed as synonymous with the student movements of the 1960s and America's collective historical memory. In retrospect, however, the New Left did not have an equally compelling political impact. The radicalism of the New Left ultimately alienated the movement from the vast majority of the population, including the student population. So the New Left's escalating rhetoric that led this escalated to civil disobedience and direct action was a great source of backlash. Initially, the Port Huron Statement, which was one of the seminal documents of the New Left, called for participatory democracy and non-violent disobedience as ways in which to change society. By 1964, a Berkeley student, Mario Savio, penned An End to History, in which he stated, lamented the Kafkaesque bureaucracies of the American universities that only seek to produce a complacent generation. But he also remarked that there is radical resistance willing to lash out against this product. Quote, this chrome-plated consumer's paradise would have us grow up to be well-behaved children. But an important minority of men and women to the front today have shown that they will die rather than be standardized, replaceable, and irrelevant. By 1968, Mike Klonsky, National Secretary of the SDS, published Towards a Revolutionary Youth Movement and sought to link the New Left on campus more closely with revolutionary struggles around the world. He called for de-studentizing the privileges of the university student, and he also called that attacks should also focus on the university as an arm of the corporations that exploit and oppress workers. So ultimately, the New Left's escalating rhetoric led to escalated tactics of resistance and direct action, which culminated in the actions of organizations such as the Weather Underground and their violent bombing campaigns. So then the YAF responded to this, to their benefit. The YAF's exact measures taken to combat the New Left on campus included counter-protesting, the liberation of SDS offices, and threatening lawsuits against universities who did not take adequate measures to curtail disruptive demonstrations, as well as forming coalitions with other student organizations who were resisting the radical direct action. And while many students perhaps did not understand the role of the YAF in these anti-radical coalitions, their membership increased dramatically throughout 1969 and 1970. And this article here does detail that. It also details how students at the time were not necessarily against the ideology of the New Left, more so with the direct action of the New Left getting in inconveniencing their lives as university students. So this policy of coalition building was not lost on the forward-thinking leaders of the YAF. One would remark, let's be realistic, we'll never have the campus think Barry Goldwater is a wonderful man, but that really isn't our goal. We want to create a training ground now on campuses for articulate and effective conservative leaders. No matter what SDS says, it's not the kids who rule the world, it's the adults, and this is foremost in our mind. So it was therefore important here embrace the strategy of coalition building and anti-radical resistance and the watering down of the right-wing message to expose, recruit, and train future leadership. It was this recruited leadership who would go on to compel the rise of the right, even if this recruited leadership were not committed Goldwater conservatives initially. In other words, join for the resistance to the anti-radicals and stay for the prospect of power and a career in the future. So law and order politics compelled the rise of the right insofar as they functioned to recruit and train a generation of conservative agents. Pictured here is David Keene, who was actually a national chairman of YAF at the time and ran for office on the issue of law and order on college campuses. He has since been president of the National Rifle Association, chairman for the American Conservative Union, and has worked on several Republican presidential campaigns. So the YAF did much to forge the careers of its members, so much though in 1964, a former member would lament that the YAF seems increasingly interested in high publicity projects that advance the careers of its aging yuppie inner circle, but only have tangential connections with lofty sentiments on which the organization was founded, and that the days when YAF were campus revolutionaries are long past. Bob Dole also remarks that I could name 50, Bob Dole, the prominent Republican leader, so I could name 50 people in this town from the YAF. Most of the Reagan movement was a part of that group. They were all kids who came up together, who are still friends and still work together. We have a network of people. The original group all sits around and decries the fact that young people today aren't as smart as we were, and my closest friends were people that I met through school and politics at that time and have brought each other all along since then. But furthermore than creating careers for many future conservatives out of this project, the YAF also pioneered and exposed college students to a specific brand of law and order rhetoric that would prove to be a crisis for liberalism and liberal Democrats, and they compelled the rise of right-wing politics from the 1970s to the end of the century. So after, in 1969, they published a brochure called Alternative, and internally, they regarded it as, quote, the best piece the YAF has ever produced, and the intro reads like this. The battle lines are clearly drawn. The New Left, in all its various hues of crimson, is determined to destroy society. College administrators are often too weak-kneed to either protect their property rights of the school or the individual rights of students who oppose the New Left terrorists. Our national spokesman of liberalism seemed determined to ignore the outrage of the New Leftists while incorporating their demands into an increasing drive for more and more federal power and control over the lives of our citizens. This is the exact law and order rhetoric that would ultimately prove most effective in destroying the credibility of liberal Democrats who advocated for the end of poverty and crime through government programs. The brochure identified the New Left as a threat to students' individual rights, and most importantly, it established liberals as allies to radicals who give in to their demands by creating government programs. And the obvious target here was President Johnson's Great Society program project. Furthermore, some students would also remark that there was an absence of liberal organizations on campuses at the time, which meant that students who wouldn't agree with their tactics saw themselves threatened by the left, would have joined fraternities in the 50s and had beer parties. Now they're joining the right. So the YAF also sued, quote, progressively liberal college administrations who yielded concessions to the leftist activists, characterizing colleges as liberal and ineffectual in protecting the rights of citizens and thus positioning themselves as vanguards against this form of unrest. And they actually still use this litigious strategy to this day. They were sued recently at the University of California, Los Angeles for canceling a conservative speaker from speaking. So anyway, I'd just like to talk briefly on the legacy of this kind of law and order politics. As I said before, law and order politics did lay the groundwork for this new Jim Crow we see today, which is a mass incarceration state that is racially disparate in many ways. And it also resulted in the stigmatization of root cause poverty solutions such as welfare, and which ultimately resulted in the New Democrats, which were Democrats more willing to cut welfare programs, willing to sign the 1994 crime bill as well, which toughened our actions against crime. And we saw this today in our recent election with Hillary Clinton trying to escape the legacy of her husband and her use of the word super predator back when the crime bill was being passed. And just a quick reminder that Donald Trump today is